Welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Sentence, and I'll be chairing today's seminar. And I'm delighted that we've got our own Bobby Whyte come to talk to us today. Bobby is a computing education researcher with a background in primary education and educational research. He's got extensive experience working as a primary school teacher in Ireland, the UK, and Italy. He completed his PhD in Learning Sciences at the University of Nottingham, and he joined us at the Raspberry Pi Foundation last year in 2022. He's going to be talking to us about integrating primary computing and literacy through multimodal storytelling. Bobby, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks very much, Sue. Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to see people joining in from so many countries. I hope it's a respectable hour for you to be here. As Sue said, I'm Bobby Whyte. I currently work at the Raspberry Pi Foundation as a research scientist, but for this presentation, I'm actually going to be talking to you about my PhD project. So I finished that up just over a year ago, and yeah, very excited to talk to you about it today. So the title of my talk, Designing Multimodal Composition Activities for Integrated K-5 Programming Storytelling. What is that? What is multimodal composition? We'll get into it all. And so, yes, okay. So an overview of the sort of structure of the talk, fairly standard. I'll give you a sort of sense of the context, particularly for those of you joining us from outside of England, because there's some sort of, there's a kind of context there that I'll give you a bit of background in. I sent a bit of a rationale for why I did this study, a little bit about the design of sort of what we created. And then we'll get into the sort of methodology. We use sort of design-based methods and some of the analytical tools that we sort of developed in order to answer some of our questions. I'll be presenting two studies today. I think I have enough time. So two studies from the project, and just talking a bit about the findings of those, and then, yeah, standard, I'll draw some conclusions and a caution, so you might want to stick around for that. And a postscript of just something that came to my attention shortly after completing the project, which would have been useful during the project. Right, so what is the context? So in England, the sort of, if we look at the history of the development of computing education in this country, and other countries, so we have these grassroots organizations, sort of CS for All, Computing at School, that really sort of led the charge for computing to be embedded in schools. In 2013, we obviously had the introduction of the computing curriculum, the mandatory computing curriculum. And then since then, we've had sort of follow-up work looking at, well, how have teachers been getting on, right? What do they think about this? What are the sort of challenges that we face as educators, as teachers, and as researchers? And where I come into this picture is that I moved to the country in 2015 as a primary school teacher. And so I was sort of in the thick of it as the curriculum had been introduced. And so while working in schools, taking part in a lot of CPD events and developing sort of curriculum plans and things like that. And but also recognizing some of the challenges that myself and other colleagues faced, you know, finding resources, teaching lessons, and things like that. And so that led me to want to do a PhD in education, but specifically looking at computing. And so if we look at some of those reports and things that I mentioned, so a couple of years after the introduction of the computing curriculum, we had the Royal Society report, which sort of surveyed teachers and looked at sort of how the curriculum had been instantiated into practice, let's say. And this sort of quote stood out to me, that the implementation had been patchy and fragile. And then more recent work by Laura Lark, who sort of worked with teachers as gatekeepers for this curriculum. And she wrote that, you know, teachers perceive the computer curriculum as narrow and difficult and in conflict with their beliefs and practices. And so it really paints a sort of slightly bleak picture of computing as a education as a subject, and also in terms of how it's, whether it's integrated into schools at all. And so that led me to think, that sort of resonated with me as a primary school teacher, and in working in multi-academy trusts and in schools around the city where I worked. or teachers did see the curriculum as quite narrow and difficult and sort of maybe slightly decontextualized, right? What is the value of doing computing in schools? And so, if I'm just lifting a sort of quote here from the computing curriculum. So the core of computing is the principles of information and computation, variables, loops, conditionals, parallelism operators, and data, and putting this knowledge to use. So it's quite a skilled, sort of procedural, knowledge-based curriculum, all 2 pages of it. And so I'm often sort of drawn to the work of David Weintraub and Nathan Holbert and Mike Tisenbaum, who sort of talk about this idea of sort of alternative endpoints for computing education. What about students who don't want to become data scientists or who don't want to become computer scientists? If we're serious about computing for all, then we really need to take the for all bit seriously and think about, are there other entry points and endpoints for students to access computing, and in doing so, can we make it more relevant, more applicable, and less narrow and difficult? And so that was the sort of starting point for the research as a sort of rationale. There's obviously various ways that we can sort of make computing applicable, make it relevant, integration being a very sort of strong argument for that. And so I've cherry-picked sort of a couple of examples that really resonated with me as a primary school teacher or a generalist. So we've obviously got sort of the work on Turtle Stitch, looking at how and e-textiles and this idea of STEAM, so the arts within STEM, and how we can look at how computing and particularly programming can be used to create artwork and to sort of create these beautiful maker activities and textiles and things like that. More recently, and teachers in England will be quite familiar with, and the UK and worldwide will be familiar with the work of the Scratch Maths curriculum. So looking at how programming can be used as a way to express mathematical ideas, which obviously has a sort of long history and tradition within sort of Logo and the early development of visual programming. And so that to me was a very sort of strong example of how computing and how programming could be integrated and made relevant and contextualized. But as a generalist and as a teacher, the idea of stories really resonated with me, and particularly as I saw a very strong overlap between the idea of writing programs and writing stories, right? There's a simplicity to that. And obviously there's a lot of research and a lot of theory written about programming as writing, right? That they're quite analogous forms of construction, that you write a program as you write a story, Annette V being a good example of that. But I wanted to sort of test that theory in a classroom and see whether it stood up. So this is a sort of example of the humanities within STEM, or STEAM, which sounds like an Irish person saying STEAM. So that particular context I thought would be quite useful in primary education. And so I started to look at examples, past examples of computing in literacy, or the application of computing in literacy. And so work by Nicole Pinkard on sort of narrative-driven computing activities has shown that sort of it can stimulate interest in programming and interest in computing, because there's a relevance there. Students are sort of creating their own programs, and they've got sort of agency and choice over what kind of projects that they develop. Much earlier work by Caitlin Kelleher and Randy Pausch looked at this idea of storytelling Alice and sort of earlier programming languages and how it could promote female participation as well, plus. And then sort of work by Judy Robertson and Judith Good on this adventure author and sort of these visual programming tools and how they could be used to visualize a narrative. So beyond just sort of telling a story, that you could sort of see the story visually represented. And so these were quite powerful in terms of creating visual stories. But obviously it's not all plain sailing. And so some work by Adams and Webster compared story-based programs in Scratch with games in Scratch and music videos and lots of different types of projects, and found that given that stories are highly linear, right? This happens, then this happens, then this happens. It precludes sort of novice programmers from employing concepts like variables and loops and conditional statements and things like that. So it's kind of one point against doing creating story-based programs. And then finally, Ronnie Scherer and her colleagues looked at the cognitive affordances or benefits of programming and found that literacy benefited the least from students learning to program. This isn't necessarily surprising, given that they define literacy as reading comprehension and writing skills. And in terms of the overlap between programming and those forms of literacy skills, it's they're quite disparate activities. And so I guess within the literature base, we find this sort of to and fro between sort of computing as a context for storytelling, storytelling as a context for computing. But as a sort of a generalist and someone who wants to integrate these two and see what is the value of bringing them together, and in a sense, can I kill two birds with one stone, right? Like computing often is squeezed in the curriculum, it's quite crowded, there isn't a lot of time to do sort of these more luxurious activities. Could there be a way that we integrate computing and literacy and look at the value of sort of teaching them together? So rather than applying one to the other, it's the integration of computing with literacy and affording them sort of equal status, if you will, in lessons. But we obviously needed to think of a sort of a framework or a way of doing this, like what makes sense when you integrate stories and programs, which can sometimes be quite disparate things. And we settled on this idea of multimodal composition, because of course students aren't writing when they're creating stories in Scratch, not necessarily. They're doing a lot more than that, right? They're using a lot more than just text. They're using, so a multimodal composition or a multimodal story or a multimodal text employs a variety of modes or representations, including sound, writing, image, also gesture and movement, with a communicative function. So they want to tell a story, they want to say something. And that to me sort of seemed more aligned with the idea of visual programming, block-based programming and Scratch, because students are using all of these representations and programming them to do all different things. So to give an example, this is actually a student's project from one of the studies. So on the left, we have a monomodal text, because it's just text. It's one representation, one way of sort of representing meaning. So let's see and it's an extract from Harry Potter. So let's see what's behind that door. Harry called, door creaked, basilisk appears, Expelliarmus, the Philosopher's Stone fell from its grip and into Harry's arms. So stories told, one representation. So this was a student who wanted to retell their favorite part of the Philosopher's Stone. And so as you can see, they're employing text, they're using images, they're programming a little bit of motion to have the Philosopher's Stone fly into Harry's arm. And then they're sort of resetting everything so that when you execute the program again, everything goes back to the way it was. So the variables are reset and characters are moved back into the correct positions. And so that's an example of a multimodal text, right? So there's a lot more to it, right? It's not just a case of presenting text. And we thought this would be quite a nice way to sort of frame bringing programming goals and storytelling goals together in a sort of natural way, rather than a kind of unhappy bedfellows. And so some of the considerations that students would need to consider to create a multimodal text would be the choice of representation. So what assets would they use? The combination of these representations and how they're used to tell different things, how they're sequenced, so how they're programmed in order to be a cohesive story that makes sense. And then thinking about the reader effect. So in terms of programming, the end user, what is their experience of a program when they execute it, if the author wasn't there, or the programmer. To give you an example of then what that would look like in Scratch. So we have the programming environment that the student worked in, and content and representation. Well, that's everything that's on the stage, everything that we see. Then we also look at how they structure the text. Now, if it was in a monomodal text, if it was a written text, then it would be paragraphs and it would be headings, and that would be different ways that you could structure a story. Obviously in Scratch we don't have that, right? Sometimes it's actually quite difficult to put text into a Scratch program because you have to use image-based sprites and things like that. But with a Scratch-based story, they use hat blocks. So they use different when blocks and broadcast messages and things like that in order to break up different scenes and different events in their stories. But then additionally, they can use a lot of these blocks and motion and looks and all of these different effects for narrative effect, right? So in the example that you just saw, they use sort of changing coordinates to show a philosopher's stone flying into a wizard's hand. So they're using it for different narrative affordances. So we thought we would design something that teachers could use, a curriculum unit. And for that, we needed an appropriate methodology. Obviously, in the learning sciences and in computing education research, design-based research is quite common. It's quite popular because there are a couple of benefits of it. You sort of have you can go through multiple cycles of iteration. So you can think about designing something, testing it in the field, learning something, gaining new insights, going back, redesigning, etc. So in other words, you don't have to get it right the first time, which I didn't. But ultimately, it tells us something about these resources in practice and what are the opportunities, but also what are the challenges and the trade-offs. It's also looking at sort of embedding theory in practice, so sort of putting it into the hands of teachers and saying, well, how did you get on with that? Was it feasible? Did it work? And embedded in real world settings. So it's not a sort of clinical setting. So what did that look like for this study? Well, so it started with some teacher interviews and a kind of feasibility study where we spoke to teachers in an earlier sort of pilot and asked them about the challenges that they were facing. And we also looked at the computer science education literature. And from there, we sort of derive ideas, design principles, theory, teaching materials in some cases, if we look at curriculum documents and things. So lesson activities, learning activities, lesson plans, scaffolding materials. So we create a design. And from there, we test it in practice. And we sort of evaluate it through different means, depending on the context. And then we repeat that process multiple times. So cyclical. For this project, we did that 3 times. So we had an initial pilot where we sort of, I was the facilitator as a sort of first study. We collected some process data, we interviewed students and teachers, evaluated the design, revised it, tested it again. And then we did the same process 3 times. On the 3rd time, because up until that point, we'd been working in after-school clubs, we thought it was quite important to put it in during regular classroom instruction, right, which can often be the sort of slightly more challenging access. But ultimately, if the idea is to introduce this to a classroom, then it should be in a classroom and not an after-school club. So that was one challenge. So for today, I'm going to talk about those 2 studies, study 1 and study 2. So the first one looking at multimodal composition, how we can sort of draw out some of these programming and storytelling practices. And then the second study was then giving that design to a teacher or to a school, having them trial it in classrooms and sort of seeing how feasible it is in terms to implement when the assistant isn't there, if that makes sense. Okay, so study 1, which is this one here. So what we started with was finding curriculum documents that would be relevant for this sort of activity. And we quite liked the creative computing curriculum from colleagues at Harvard Graduate School and the Creative Computing Lab. And we quite liked this particular unit because it's sort of, because it had this very nice structure, which seemed appropriate for programming in Scratch, which was that you start with characters, then you move to conversations, from there you develop scenes, and then you can repeat that process iteratively, build up scenes, and then you've generated a story, which seemed quite nice. So what does that look like for a student? They add a sprite, they add another sprite, they program some sort of interaction between them. It could be dialogue, it could be sort of some other mechanism. They program different backdrops and different settings to give us some information, additional objects or different elements that might be working in the background to tell different parts of the story, rain moving, things flying across the screen, different things like that. So that's sort of the sort of process of generating a multimodal text in Scratch. But then we wanted to sort of take that back and think about, well, so we have these activities, right? Students deciding on representation, structuring text, using different technical features of the medium, of the environment, and then programming their own story. What would those goals be? Like, what are they doing in terms of storytelling, practicing storytelling, and what are they doing in terms of practicing programming? And so we sort of generated, based on these activities, a set of learning goals. And these are quite high level, and we'll break them down a bit further later on. But the idea is that we're trying to look to see the integration of these activities, where they integrate and where they don't, right? Because if we can sort of argue that students can naturally sort of tell a story while programming, as opposed to tell a story and then do some programming, then I think we can sort of make a strong case for why these things should be integrated. And so we've taken some of these conjectures, I guess you would call them, from different literature, looking at multimodal text, but also thinking about specifically, because all of these things are quite context specific. In Scratch, you know, it would look very different than if they were creating something in PowerPoint, let's say. But then one challenge that presents itself to us is how we analyze that, right? Because we're not looking at it just as a program. We're not looking at it just as a story. We're looking at it as both. So we have a challenge to simultaneously assess student work as both an instance of programming and also an instance of storytelling. And so going back to the literature, we were quite inspired by work in the learning sciences, and particularly work in mathematics education on hypothetical learning trajectories, where you sort of predict or you anticipate how learning will occur, and then you observe it and you compare the two. So that's kind of broadly the approach. And also conjecture mapping by Bill Sandoval. But we wanted something quite granular, so we could really dig down into how students were creating these texts. And one example of a conjecture-based analysis that stood out to us was this idea of a task-oriented analysis by Adrie Deerdorp and colleagues in the Netherlands. And particularly, it's quite fine-grained in terms of looking at how students complete an activity, and that appealed to us. But again, we're looking at programming and storytelling, so we wanted to adapt it so that it would be analyses that were looking at two things simultaneously. And so that's what we did. What does a task-oriented analysis look like? So I'll give you a hypothetical example. Let's say the task is to create an introduction to a story, so very much a literacy activity. So we would take that activity and break it down into the steps, not necessarily chronological or procedural, but the sort of steps or tasks that a student would need to do in order to complete that activity. And so they might introduce characters and describe their appearance or represent it in some way. They might provide background details, behaviors, background information. They might establish setting, tell us a little bit about where the story is set. They might illustrate narrative events using dialogue, or they might illustrate narrative events using exposition, so like a narrator. And then we take those tasks and we apply them to students' projects, to any kind of data that we have that tells us how they completed these tasks. And we very crudely count them up. And so in this example, I'm pretending there's 12 students in this group. So in task 1, all 12 students did that. And so we can tick 12 out of 12. In activity 2, 10 out of 12 completed that. Then 9, then 4 for the fourth one, and then 9 for the fifth one. And so we create a kind of representation of the shape of an activity. And we can say, well, actually, most students completed these tasks, and some students didn't complete this task. And then from there, because we have these, we can spot these gaps. It sounds a little bit like a sort of the Ofsted framework or something like that. We can consider why that might be, right? Is it that they just didn't want to do it? Is it that they couldn't do it? Is it that there wasn't enough scaffolding provided? Was it not relevant? And from there, we can think about how we reconfigure instruction, scaffolding materials, or use different activities. That's just an example for storytelling, right? So it would look something like this. But obviously, in our case, we're looking at stories, projects as stories and projects as programs as well. So we would have two sets of conjectures that we would test. and then lay them against one another like this, which looks quite messy, but is quite interesting because then you can sort of plot this shape. And we'll take a look at some examples of that in a minute. We'll take a look at an example now. This is one of the activities, or sort of one of these multimodal composition activities, which is to use structural devices to organize texts. And depending on the context, that will be very different. So let's look at it, what that would be for Scratch. So we have, in terms of the storytelling goals, that a student would sequence events for cohesion. This happens, then this happens, then this happens. If we change the order, it doesn't work. And then in terms of programming goals, the students would use these weight blocks and different ways of coordinating when sprites come in, when sprites disappear, how long before they say something, how long before they speak again, so they don't interrupt one another. So that's one simple way that they could do that. But then as we get into longer compositions, where they have multiple scenes, where they have multiple more complex structures, they might use broadcast messages to coordinate multiple scripts. Once this scene is done, then do a broadcast message. When I receive this message, play this scene. But they might find that quite challenging. So they might use when blocks as well. So there's different strategies and different approaches the students can use to accomplish those storytelling tasks, different programming approaches or strategies. So for that first study, or the first one I'm going to talk about today, we were really interested in how could these activities be designed to support these integrated programming and storytelling practices. So it took place in a primary school in England, here in Nottingham. There was 10 participants. It was quite a small group, but it was quite a lot of data. So in order to sort of get through screen recordings and things like that, it was necessary to keep it quite small. The intervention took place over 6 weeks, 1 hour a week, in an after-school setting, and that's quite important. And then we collected screen capture videos, audio transcripts, observation notes, participant projects, etc. And to give you a sense of what some of these projects looked like, I think I'm extolling the virtues of multimodal texts while showing you lots of text rather than images and things. But certainly in terms of their projects, they were quite rich examples of sort of multimedia texts. They used popular books and media, Harry Potter and Diary of a Wimpy Kid, imported all of these assets and then manipulated them in order to tell different effects. So in the bottom right example, you can see this chap from Diary of a Wimpy Kid, and the students redesigned a second costume and then programmed a loop so that the character would, or not a loop, a loop, so that a character would go out and shake hands with multiple friends, which is quite sweet. So then we think of sort of, well, looking at these student projects at the end, once they've completed their sort of final project, well, how good is it, or not how good is it, but what storytelling practices did it evoke? And so we can see that sort of for all these students in this group, they use multiple representations for specific purposes. So all of them used sort of different images and text and sound in order to tell some stories. In the previous example, the Harry Potter one, there was a sound effect of a creaking door, but you couldn't hear it. They structured their text with these event-based blocks to sort of segment out each scene in their story, usually about 3 scenes because they're quite short stories. And most of them used some form of motion or animation in order to tell that story. So whether that's a loop function to have a character walking across the screen, or whether that's just using different XY plotting in order to move characters. I'll show you one example. This is Leah's story. It's called The Invisible Kidnapper. You'll see why. So it starts with a character moving around. She's programmed shoes to play the invisible kidnapper, which is quite clever. And then she's using broadly text and also motion to tell the story. It's in a school setting. And then I think the character gets, it's quite dark, quite dark 9-year-olds telling these stories. Then they go down an alleyway. Then she gets captured, put inside a bin, and then, or inside a room. Then they realize the door is unlocked. So she reappears again. Oh, I'm free. And then finally escapes to the cliffs of Moher, and the video ends, and then accidentally falls off. So quite a dark ending. But ultimately, I think what you can see from that example was that the student had sort of 3 clear scenes within their story, quite a nice narrative arc, and then quite carefully programmed each individual scene so that when you click, in terms of repeat execution, it's the same text every time. They don't have to repeat, they don't have to reset everything manually. So, they're resetting these objects. They're inputting, when green flag is clicked, move the character to this location, hide it, and don't show it until. They're thinking about sort of the end user and how this program is experienced by someone else. Where we found instances where students didn't do that, we just pointed at where they sort of manually reset it in order to play the story again. We showed them different strategies and ways that they could reset their programs. And then they use a lot of event-based programming features, which makes sense because these are sort of linear or procedural stories. So this needs to happen, then this needs to happen, and this while that's happening. So there's lots of broadcast scripts and wait blocks and things that students used in order to keep things coordinated. And then finally, loop functions in order to simulate the motion and animation between these characters. So you can see this this example here of a repeat loop where they change the size a little bit every time, and they kept playing around with the variables in order to get it just right, that it looked like the characters went into that castle. So there's a lot of sort of tinkering with different code. This is an example of what one of those task-oriented analyses looks like. So we've sort of color-coded it to sort of see, well, of those 10 students, how many did all those things? And you can see the kind of lighter green examples where, for example, broadcast scripts, where only half the students used broadcast scripts, whereas most of them used when blocks and wait blocks, and you could see them counting the time with their fingers rather than using these sorts of passing messages between different scripts. So that was slightly less common in the group. And that reflected partly the experience of the students, and also loops. So more than half of the group used loops, but not all of them. And where they didn't, they had sort of manually created different, like drew the animation rather than programmed it, which is quite interesting. So then we sort of modified that design slightly as we brought it into the third iteration. So we embedded more meaningful examples into activities. Well, why would I use a loop? Oh, because I can do this kind of animation, or I can do this kind of activity. And also we had some additional instructional supports. So one of the kind of earlier iterations, the sort of pilot study, we found that students weren't necessarily finding it difficult to program, or well, they were, but that the significant challenge was generating a story idea and thinking about sort of multiple scenes and how they start, continue, and end their story. And so we added additional sort of instructional activities to help them into that process, and also examples of that. And then also explicit instruction on broadcast messaging and why you would do it, and what are some of the affordances of it, just to sort of really make it explicit. Why would you do why would I use this code when I could use this code, which is much easier? So that brings us to the third study, right? So we've sort of looked at multimodal storytelling. We've looked at sort of what are some of the affordances of it for programming, what are some of the affordances of it for storytelling, but all of this took place in a classroom setting. And so what we then did was take the lessons and co-adapt them, I guess I would say, with the school for the final study. And so then we were interested in how could this unit of work be adapted for regular classroom instruction, right? Where you have additional challenges and additional pressures, time issues and things like that. You know, it's quite luxurious in an after-school setting to sort of do these activities. Again, it took place in a different primary school in England. And our initial plan was to work with multiple teachers within one sort of multi-academy trust. But then with the onset of schools closures, we had to condense like 3 months of data collection into 2 weeks. So we worked with one teacher and one class, 28 participants. So a typical classroom, and one teacher who was also the computing coordinator of the school. It took place over 2 weeks, 1 hour daily, three lessons a week over 2 weeks or something like that. We collected the same data in order to enable us to do that analysis again. But additionally, we collected interview data with the teacher. So we sort of at the end and throughout, we sort of interviewed him. Let's call him Jake. We interviewed Jake about his experience of teaching the unit, different adaptations that he made, and also sort of what he thought about the unit in general, sort of feasibility and things like that, and value. And then we broadly took a sort of like an implementation analysis of how he got on implementing the curriculum, which broadly looks at a couple of different areas of focus. One being the participant experiences, so students and teacher, some enhancing or inhibiting factors or strategies, and these are perceived, right, through interviews, and also whether the intervention was adapted or whether he intended it to be adapted in the future, whether he'd use it again if it was any good. And so we took instances through the interview scripts and applied them to this framework, and sort of generated some sub-themes, which is a sort of process called an iterative analysis. So it's neither inductive nor deductive, but it's kind of emerging from both literature and data. Some themes that emerged from these interviews afterwards. And so students taking part in the session, they quite appreciated this idea of a longer multi-session project. So computing for them up until that point had been quite sort of punctuated, so quite short bursts, 1 hour here and then maybe 1 hour in a couple of weeks. And so the idea of doing something much longer, where they could sort of work on a more complex, longer, more challenging project over multiple sessions, they found quite exciting and engaging. The classroom teacher, when we reviewed those task-oriented analyses, we took a sample of his classroom data, and then we reviewed that in sort of kind of artifact-based interviews. And he was quite satisfied with the sort of the project work that was completed and the skills that were practiced, particularly for programming. However, it's not always plain sailing. And so because being quite time poor and just generally very, very busy, right? It's a busy life. He sort of said that in terms of the resources and planning, that it needed to be made available. So it was co-adapted, but really it was co-adapted by me. And he sort of he wanted to just pick it up and do it because there wasn't much time for anything else, particularly with 28 students, which meant it was quite challenging. And then some of the things that sort of affected how the lessons went in that third study. So one of the things that we talked about was his confidence in teaching programming as a factor. So I don't see myself as a coder, right? And this is, again, one of the challenges of primary education. These are generalists, right? And if there aren't opportunities for CPD, or if teachers just don't have that confidence, then working on things like open-ended projects become a bit challenging, more challenging. As also a special needs assistant, he found one thing challenging in terms of differentiating not only what is being taught, but who it's being taught to. So a lot of students didn't have formal experiences of programming or computing at home or in the school, so they were quite playing catch up with, let's say, curriculum expectations. And so one of the challenges was sort of quite basically showing students how to use mice, keyboards and things like that, open documents. So that sort of impacted on some of the success of the sessions. And then finally, this third one, which was quite important, the school expectations and quite high standards meant that the lesson was perceived as literacy light, right? We were arguing that this could be an integrated unit, either in or in both literacy and computing. But given the sort of pressures on students and teachers to produce text, right? The curriculum specifies text. It doesn't specify multimodal stories. It's not even an explicit mention in the most recent curriculum documents. And so he said, would they see this as a wasted literacy lesson? And this is the point about sort of cross-curricular computing that I think is quite important, that we end up with something that's neither computing nor literacy, right? And it's sort of it's neither one nor the other, which is a real challenge when we're thinking about integration. And then finally, we talked a little bit about intervention adaptations. So, what changes did he make? Would he use it again? And so one of the things that we developed was additional sort of teacher guidance, because the teacher was new to sort of these kind of applied contexts for computing, but also multimodal composition. There was a need to create additional teacher structures and sample texts and things like that in order to sort of give him that sort of scaffolding that he needed in order to sort of teach these activities and to talk to students about the affordances of multimodal text effects or whatever. So that was an additional requirement in order for it to, and that was a kind of iteration made throughout. And then this, I don't know why this red thing keeps appearing. Another adaptation that he intended to make was to separate the computing and literacy activities. So up until now, it had been a kind of broadly, the silos had been kind of blurred, or the lines had been blurred. It was neither a computing activity nor a literacy activity, but it was trying to be both. And quite practically, he intended to sort of do the story component in the classroom and then take it into the computing room and then translate what students would create as stories onto the screen. But obviously that's translation, that's not generation. So it's a very different activity. And also thinking about these idea of open-ended projects where students have agency and they can tell their own stories. He intended to, working with other teachers in the school, to make it more prescriptive, limit the time spent troubleshooting student projects, and over his concern over his ability and others to do so. Because of course, with an open-ended project, you have 28 instances where a student could create something that you don't know, that doesn't work. And if it's a text or an example of a project that you haven't encountered before, then you might not know how to troubleshoot or help them solve it. So in terms of thinking about how the unit could be adapted for all of the other teachers in the school, because he's the coordinator, one of the things was to really amp up these kinds of prescriptive measures so that the lessons were more feasible, more structured, more scaffolded. And so that was the experience of the teacher trialing the unit. So multimodal composition, what do we think about it? Well, so I would argue across all of the studies, these sorts of activities provided opportunities for learners to mutually pursue both storytelling and programming goals to various degrees of success. And then when we take it into the classroom, and we sort of try to adapt it and see if it's feasible, one thing I learned afterwards was that they trialed it another 6 times during one of the lockdowns and didn't tell me, and I would have loved that data, or at least so it was feasible. I just don't have the goods. But in terms of like how the unit can be adapted and manipulated to suit different contexts, some teachers, he reported, were using it for their topic work, which is quite a typical thing in the UK, where every term you sort of explore a different theme or topic, like ancient Egypt, and then you create a program about you program a story about the history of ancient Egypt or something like that. So we could see that the unit was sort of being integrated well into their work. But my caution, with these cross-curricular integration projects, I guess I want to argue that the affordance, both of the affordances and the trade-offs of bringing together these different content areas really need to be carefully considered, because it's not necessarily they're not necessarily happy bedfellows. And also within the context of sort of curriculum pressures and sort of trying to argue for the value of computing, if we sort of perhaps dilute it too much, then it's neither seen as a good literacy lesson or a good computing lesson. My little postscript was that shortly after I finished the thesis and just before the Viva, Scratch released some beta animated text features, which would have made my life so much easier. So basically, rather than creating sprites where you have a costume that is text, or using a narrator, which some students used as well, you can just program text to appear on the screen. So for you teachers out there, I would go to Scratch Labs, because it's quite a lot of fun if you're creating story-based programs.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Bobby. What an interesting talk. We can give Bobby a round of applause. Or next time is going to be, we've got Easter in the middle. And so I think it's the 18th of April. Is that right? The next session with Monica McGill, who is from csedresearch.org, and she'll be talking about computer science integration in across the primary curriculum. So we continue, and we've got 5 more. So thanks very much again to Bobby. Thank you all for your participation. It's really, really appreciated.